Japan Up Close.
Okay, welcome to Japan Up Close. We are interviewing Alex Smith, who has been working as a translator in Japan for about 20 years, working on first a number of Japanese video game titles, which have been extremely popular overseas, including many of the Final Fantasy titles, Ace Attorney, some of the Mega Man titles, and then also doing a number of manga and novel titles, including the mystery novel series by Keigo Higashino. So we are talking with him about what has gotten him interested in translating in Japan, what he's been working on since then, and what he's doing right now. So first of all, thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So the first question that we always ask in these interviews, what was it that drew you to Japan? What made you decide to come here and get into this line of work?
Well, I'd like to say that I had a master plan at the beginning, and this is the fruition of that plan, but that's very far from the truth. I saw anime that had been adapted for the Saturday morning cartoon lineup, and had no idea that these shows were originating in Japan. I didn't have that sort of Japanese fan culture around me, anything like that. In high school, I had the opportunity to go to China for about 4 months. This was in my senior year of high school. And I was in rural China learning Chinese from people who didn't speak any English, full immersion. And that sparked a real interest that I had in languages, and especially Asian languages, talking to other people and hearing about Japanese and how the language works, and even something as simple as katakana. If you know that Chinese, when they adopt foreign words, they have to use what in Japanese is called ateji, the sort of coming up with Chinese characters that roughly approximate the sound of the English words like McDonald's or Coca-Cola. And Japanese had katakana, and I thought, oh, that's very elegant. What an elegant solution to this, instead of trying to strong-arm kanji into doing the work. And so something as simple as that, I sparked my interest in Japanese, and I started looking into it and started studying on my own. And I went to Japan for a homestay study, just a month or so, in Osaka, the summer before going to university. And by the time that I matriculated at college, I was a Japanese major. And it went on from there.
Uh-huh. Okay, that sounds pretty familiar to me.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe also the first time I've heard katakana described as elegant. But
right. Well, yeah, I feel differently about it now, but at the time it seemed great.
Uh-huh. So how about your work in translating? How did you get involved in that?
That started in grad school. I was in a PhD program for classical Japanese literature, which I had gotten into because of a general interest in storytelling. And I know sort of if you hear classical literature, it sounds very stodgy, and you think Tale of Genji, those sort of kind of the classic works. But I was more into a genre called Setsuwa Bungaku, which was a largely Buddhist genre of writing in, say, the 10th century or so, thereabouts, for a few hundred years there. Mm-hmm. And the genre was really interesting because it was Buddhist monks who had taken stories, folklore that they had heard, stories about, say, a fox that came into a village and tricked someone into thinking it was his wife, and managed to steal some rice or something like that. So the very sort of folklore stories. And then at the end of this story, they would slap this sort of Buddhist moral on at the very end, saying, and that's why you should always pray 3 times to the Buddha, or that sort of thing. That sort of thing is what drew me to classical literature. And as I was working toward my PhD, I started discovering these other things, these other kinds of storytelling. And when you look at storytelling in modern Japan, really the most vibrant area is pop culture storytelling. anime, manga, and games. And Japan in particular has almost at the time, a monopoly on strong story-driven games. And so that immediately appealed to me. Because if you think, what's the folklore of today? What are people, what's the analog to sitting around the campfire and talking about fox spirits or whatever? It's sitting around talking about video games and mana and things like that, these sort of video game concepts. And so that immediately appealed to me. I started working at a local video game store in Boston when I was still in grad school, and I would sort of translate anime series for them. I did an internship at Sega, the game company, in Japan between my first and second year in grad school. And when I had already decided that I didn't want to go through with the full PhD program, I left after getting a master's and applied, kind of cold called, applied to Squaresoft, as it was called back in the day. Now it's Square Enix, and got the job there. And that was my first sort of official translation job.
Following up on the video games, for a lot of people, especially a lot of young people, video games have often been their first exposure to Japanese culture, Japanese, cultural properties, Japanese ideas. What is it you think that, why do you think these works have resonated so well with audiences outside of Japan?
I think that it was because, especially at the time, the Japanese game industry really respected storytelling and put a strong emphasis on telling these moving emotional stories that you just didn't see anywhere else in the genre. At the time, and this is back when sort of Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 2, those really early games were coming out, the late 80s, early 90s. You had very little to compete with it in the West. And I think the Japanese game industry got that reputation for telling these stories. And when Final Fantasy 7 came out, that was a real watershed moment for American gamers. So I think it really resonated with a lot of people in that generation. The first generation many of us had our own consoles at home, and those stories were coming directly into the living rooms. And so that really helped. And as the game industry as a whole matured, I think the emphasis on the visual appeal of Japanese games, especially the Final Fantasy series, also really helped, because you could play sort of a lot of what we consider now retro style games with sort of primitive graphics, and your imagination could kind of take you to places. But when you started playing these Final Fantasy games, you were just blown away. It was like watching a movie in a lot of ways. So I think that helped as well, keep those games popular.
You've worked on video games, you've worked in manga, you've worked on novels, you've even worked in publishing. What was the biggest challenge of translating video games? What is it that's different about that from translating more static works such as manga or novels?
I think the central difference between translating something like printed media, a manga or a novel, and translating a game is, it comes down to context and how important context is in translation. Because if you say, hey, what does this word mean? I might be able to look in a dictionary and tell you, oh, this word in Japanese means, sakana in Japanese means fish in English, that kind of thing. And that's very simple. But if you start translating dialogue or translating the description of a scene, suddenly it becomes very important to know what your context is. Right. Because the way that the Japanese language and the English language describe a moment or describe an emotion can be very, very different. And they're coming at it from such different angles that if you don't truly understand what the situation is and what the emotion is and what the intended effect of the original is, you cannot hope to replicate that accurately and convincingly in English. And this holds true, I think, for almost every language pairing, but especially for Japanese to English, because Japanese is a high context language and English is a relatively lower context language. Mm-hmm. So when you're approaching a translation project, if you've got a book or a manga, the context is all right there. You just have to read it. But if it's a game, you really have to play the game. And you also have to understand how games operate, how storytelling within games operates. It's a very unusual genre in that way. That's not as straightforward because it is interactive.
So as you mentioned earlier, your educational background was in classical Japanese literature. So have you been able to apply that in your game or novel translations in any way?
Not as much as one might hope, having spent 2 years learning sort of classical Japanese. Obviously, even if some games will trend a little archaic in the language that they use, no one is actually writing in classical Japanese, which is a separate language really from modern Japanese. As different, well, maybe not quite as different, but in the ballpark of, say, Old English versus modern English, where in many places they're mutually unintelligible languages. So nobody's actually whipping out the kogo for their, to add flavor to a video game text. However, I think just in terms of being familiar, I mentioned context earlier but there's also a context within a language, understanding how certain phrases and even how certain words feel in the context of that language. And just for a sort of easy example, even when you are writing in English, it's very, very powerful. It's a very powerful tool to understand and know how to use words from different origins. And the big two in English being words from Old English or sort of Germanic origin, and words being from French, the Romantic or Latin origin. And so, because those words have a very different feel, a good example would be, say, church and cathedral. They are both places of worship. But when I say church, you think of homey. You may think of like a community. It brings all this imagery together with it. But if I say cathedral, you think lofted arches and maybe some beautiful art and lots of sort of gold, and it's beautiful. And this is, holds true throughout English. And similarly, in Japanese, you have words of sort of Japanese indigenous origin, and you also have words of Chinese origin. And those have a very similar kind of difference in how they feel. And understanding the etymology of words and understanding when certain words came into the Japanese language can help give you a better feel for how these words operate and how they feel for the educated reader or viewer of Japanese media.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. As a last question, I encounter a lot of people who are themselves hoping to get into translation or possibly even interpretation or other sorts of media type work in Japanese. Many of these people are fans of anime and manga and are hoping to do the same kind of work you've been doing themselves. Would you have any advice for these people who are hoping to get into translation in Japanese? Or, I mean, if that can expand to anything else into other languages as well.
Sure. I get this question a lot too, as you might expect.
Sure.
And the majority of people, their primary concern is, how much Japanese do I need to know in order to translate from Japanese to English? And there's this emphasis, especially in the hiring process, of, you have to have passed the Japanese proficiency test, the JLPT1 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And those are good. Those tests are good as a marker of how, familiar you are with the language and that sort of thing. But I don't feel like they capture one of the most important aspects of learning a language and understanding a language to the point where you can translate from it, which is understanding, again, the context of the language. If you don't know what to expect from a text or a game, then you will never know when the text is something unexpected. Mm-hmm. And being able to understand that, I think, is really, really important, because if you just know enough to decipher the text, that's probably not enough. You probably also need to know, well, usually, they would say this, and you have to be able to guess what they're going to go to. And that's a big part of genre fiction as well. Mystery writing, that sort of thing. If you don't know what's coming, it's very, very hard to realize it when somebody's being ironic or somebody is throwing you a curveball.
Right.
And to be able to properly replicate that experience in the new language. So that's sort of the bar that I set for source language competency. But the real truth here is that the thing that will separate sort of the good translators, and you can be, I think, a good translator if you have an excellent comprehension of the source language and decent writing skills in English, but you would never be a great translator unless you excelled in English writing. And as a practical matter, most people have a genre, or two at most, where they can excel. Which is fine. And that's really good for building a career as well. If you become the guy or the girl that is the go-to person for, say, a particular kind of writing, you can really build a career out of that. Okay. And that's where you will make a difference between yourself and other translators.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us with Japan Up Close. It's been a great time talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Japan Up Close.